Okay, hello and welcome to this IconS New Scholarship Showcase. I'm Rehan Abiratna, one of the co-chairs of the IconS Committee on New Directions in Scholarship. I'm also a professor and associate dean at the Western Sydney University School of Law. We are featuring a terrific book today, Legalizing the Revolution, India and the Constitution of the Postcolony, published by Cambridge University Press in 2024, and the winner of the IconS Book Prize this year, 2025. The author is Sandipto Dasgupta, who is an assistant professor of politics at the New School for Social Research, where his work investigates the history of modern political and social thought, especially the political theory of empire, decolonization, and post-colonial presence. So welcome, Sandipto. Thank you for doing this. Let me,
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
great. Well, let me start by asking you to broadly describe the book and the main claims that you advance in it.
Right. So the book is titled Legalizing the Revolution, which is one of the main claims. But let me start by saying I think for me, the first and the most important claim perhaps is a methodological one. And that's to say that the history and sort of our analysis in political theory of decolonization as an historical event in mid-20th century and constitutional theory as a discipline in the way we study constitutions needs to talk to each other. And it sounds quite straightforward, but I think for the longest time, one has been the remit of, say, political scientists and historians, and other the remit of legal scholars who read constitutions mostly out of trying to figure out legal principles and doctrines, and they haven't really spoken to each other, right? So the first kind of, I think, methodological um, challenge for me was to how to make sort of the history of decolonization. What does that say about constitutional theory? And vice versa, what does a study of post-colonial constitution making tell us about the trajectories and dynamics of decolonization, right? So this kind of, they speak with each other. And then sort of a more substantive set of claims comes out of that. I think I would say for each in one in sort of constitutional theory and one in terms of decolonization. I think in terms of decolonization, when I sort of studied the constitution making process as sort of an archive of this project of building institutions after independence from empire, what we realized is that the kind of the main sort of contradiction of challenge of decolonization comes out as is attempt to institute popular sovereignty, but without popular politics, which was the driving force of the anti-colonial movement. And I think that this contradiction between sort of institutionalized popular sovereignty and popular politics creates for me a central dynamic in the way post-colonial politics will play out. And then on the side of constitutional theory, I wanted to argue that for post-colonial constitutions, the orienting principle is not sort of creating an abiding order, which is I think often how we think about constitutions in sort of Western constitutional theory, but one as creating a modality for far-going social transformation. Often you call it developmentalism and so on, but without revolutionary rupture or disruptions, right? So, and that's where the term legalizing the revolution. And so you get a constitutional structure whose orienting principle is orderly change, right? Rather than, kind of creating certain kind of limits. Um, and that's what would be my substantive claim with the constitutional theory. And out of these two then comes, throughout the book, there are several other sort of smaller kind of bits of argument comes out about the nature of the anti-colonial movement, the role of administrators as constituent actors, the relationship between property and constitutionalism, and relationship between, let's say, judicial review and social change. But those are kind of follows downstream from these two main claims I want to advance.
Terrific. So let me just ask you a little bit more about your approach then, because this is a tremendously ambitious book, both in terms of the wide lens you adopt from the time
Right.
span from the colonial era to the 1970s, and as you've just highlighted, the range of topics you cover. So you cover the administrative state, you cover judges and lawyers, you cover property structures, among other things. Was this always the plan, or did you end up writing a broader book than you may have initially sort of started out to write?
That's a very good question. No, this wasn't, this if I came up with this plan in the beginning, it would be very unsound, I think, and I would have been warned off at the very beginning. I think this is what it took because I think it's kind of follows from the first point I was making about the method, right? And if you have to kind of marry these two things, which is kind of an analysis, a rigorous analysis of the dynamics of the anti-colonial movement and the transition from anti-colonial to post-colonial context, as well as sort of the kind of detailed institutional analysis which constitutional theory demands of us, right? That required this level of both the breadth and the depth, and that did, of course. The book took a while to write, partly because of that reason, because it required me to therefore then sort of sort of gets my hands dirty, so to speak, with say, political economy, with history, with sociology, forms of, as you said, sort of forms of property or nature of colonial, state formation, or the questions of the intellectual history of legal thought in India, and so on and so forth, and try to bring them together. And I hope that works, and the book is not too unwieldy for that.
No, I think it works very well, but it is a tremendous undertaking. So, it's really very impressive the amount of material you cover. Let me go back to something you said at the beginning about um, the literatures with which you are engaging and kind of
Right,
how your book is situated. So, as you say, the book sits in an interesting place between the kind of constitutional law literature and, should we say, maybe which, as you note in the book, is tends to be more triumphalist about the Constitution,
right,
and the kind
right,
of social science humanities literature that highlights its many failings.
right,
And so, your book is sort of normatively also, not just sort of content-wise, but normatively somewhere in the middle. And I was wondering who
right,
your intended audience was. Were you trying to speak to both sets of scholars? Were you trying to
right.
speak more to one than the other?
So yeah, I think this is a very good. So maybe to try to formulate as well as kind of what you can call sort of motivating questions, right? So yes, I think it is ideally the both set of scholars will find something of use in the book, and but this was the kind of debates I think in both these fields that kind of began my thought about the book, right? So in the field of constitutional theory, I think the question for me was I went to law school before I did my PhD. And we was always taught law, constitutional law, public law, especially through sort of a series of case laws. And the premise was that so the fundamental questions were kind of all settled, and what we need to kind of figure out are these various different legal interpretations, right? I think behind that actually was sort of a vision of constitution, understanding of constitution as a kind of juridical compact with certain values which we all agree we should have, certain kind of rights, let's say, separation of powers and limits. And really the question now becomes one of interpretation and implementation, right? That's really where the analytical payoff is. And so for that, I really kind of wanted to ask the question. And so again, sorry, just so there is, if you go another step back to that, because I'm studying this in India to begin with, right? And it seemed to me then the premise is that the main sort of tenets of what a constitution should be and can be, right, are already kind of settled in through the experiences of Western liberal democracies. And then after decolonization, the goal is really to sort of diffuse that out into the newly decolonized world, right? So, in other words, you already have the template. And the question is really as a process of adaptation, right? How well can we take that template? And I want to start from a different point of view to think of constitutions not necessarily as a juridical compact to be adapted, but as a political architecture to be built after independence, right? It's about an architecture of how do we live collectively in this newly independent world that after we are out of empire, drawing from the principles of the anti-colonial struggle. And if you do it like that, then the post-colonial world demands its own constitutional theory, which is not just one of translation, but actually a one of creation, right? And so that was the kind of the entry point to the debates in constitutional theory to think about what would a post-colonial constitutional theory be, which is rooted in its own history and its own project of institution making, right? And then, sorry, and then in sort of in the decolonization literature, I think that's another term which has been in wide circulation in the last sort of a decade or so, right? More than a decade. And but to me, it seemed like, especially in the Western academia, decolonization became primarily understood as a discursive project. It's about knowledge formation. It's about epistemic imperialism and so on, which I think is a very important project in its own terms. But I also want to look at decolonization as a historical project. And when you do that, and again, I come from a country, of course, which had its anti-colonial movement and decolonization. And there, I think there are two registers. There's a register of all the expansive promise which you kind of had at the moment of freedom, right? About creating a new freedom world. And of course, the limits which became quite apparent within a decade or two of decolonization, which is and out of which sort of the material of post-colonial political life was created through this tension between this expansive promise and its quite apparent limits, right? And so I wanted to sort of capture the story of decolonization on both those counts. And the constitution making, the archive of the constitution making, provided with me with the kind of material, we can think of it as sort of a concurrent record, right? Of these challenges of how do we create institutions, what are the kind of contradictions that exist in that, what are the kind of challenges, the kind of conflicts. And so that was sort of how I wanted to enter the conversation regarding a political theory of decolonization, right? So that was in those two literatures, as you said, were my kind of points of entry.
Great. And I can't let you go further without asking a little more about that
Right,
tension that you just raised with
right,
between, this idea that the Constitution was supposed to be transformative in some sense. But on the other hand, of course, and as scholars of India know, adopted a lot of the Government of India Act. And there was a lot of continuity. And I thought one of the points that you made extremely well, which I wish I saw more of in Indian scholarship, was the importance of the Dominion period between
yeah,
1947 and 1950,
right, right,
understood as a means to kind of keep the existing
right,
administrative order in
right,
place to ensure a smooth transition. So can you
right,
say a little bit about that and the importance of the administrator? Because I think a big part
right,
of your claim is that the administrator became the sort of totemic figure of this
right,
revolution. So I'd love you to
right.
say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think that for me was the kind of the kind of this critical moment, which is, if you there's a very interesting sort of, I think, tension at the heart of the anti-colonial movement itself, which is on the one hand, the anti-colonial movement really becomes a plausible political force at the very moment when it starts to sort of, involve and include or mobilize the people behind its cause, right? So in the beginning, when it was sort of, a group of elite lawyers and writers sort of petitioning the government for some more freedom, that never really took us very far. It's only when, in the case of India, after the First World War, you have the launch of the Gandhian mass movement and a popular movement, and an anti-colonial movement becomes a popular cause, does it actually become a serious force, right? And even more conceptually speaking, the basis of the anti-colonial claim was popular sovereignty, right? Because the empire, in some ways, could give you a bit more rights, can give you a bit more economic development. But one thing it cannot give you is popular rule, right? Because the whole premise of empire is that the colonized people cannot govern themselves. So in contrast, the anti-colonial movement had to claim that people can govern themselves. So the claim for popular, political participation was at the heart of the anti-colonial movement. But at the very same time, popular political mobilization in a country, especially like India, with massive inequalities and hierarchies, tend to produce its own dynamics, right? And often what happened was the popular aspirations went much farther than just political independence, but demanding, farther sort of social changes in questions of property, regarding debt, regarding sort of, forms of labor, and so on. Right. And as sort of the movement progressed in the 30s, especially after the Depression, as it became more radicalized, these demands became more and more intense. And in some ways, they created an anxiety amongst the leadership of the anti-colonial movement, right? Who wanted to kind of keep the remits much more narrow to a direct confrontation between the British state and the anti-colonial movement. I think the late colonial period, the one which you sort of referenced, the 40s especially, right, is a moment when this tension becomes really the most apparent. And a couple of moves happen, therefore. I think what happens is that the Congress, as a party, the International Congress, which is the party of the anti-colonial movement, which is, by all accounts, is a mass party. It's perhaps the largest mass party in history. It has an extraordinary sort of, presence across the country, popular like branches from the way down. They nevertheless decide to kind of transform themselves from a party of popular mobilization to a party of government in waiting, right? So, in other words, they have these elections, they kind of become interim government, and they really think precisely because of the dangers of popular mobilization that the instrument they want to use for independence and the transition is not so much the popular politics, but the state itself, right? The colonial state itself. And a few things follow from that, right? One is, of course, then the keeping the continuity of the colonial state apparatus, which in the case of India was a very well developed one, which is, it's a powerful and quite extensive state apparatus. Maintaining that, inheriting that kind of, in a pristine order and using that for the process of transition became quite important rather than reinventing it or breaking it anyway. Right? That's number one. Secondly, with that comes the importance of people who know how to kind of operate the machineries of the state, and that's the administrators you're talking about, right? And of course the colonial state already had by this time mostly Indian administrators, right? It was more or less by Indian civil servants or bureaucrats or judges and lawyers and so on. And those people then become really, really critical to this project, their know-how, their knowledge, their experience. And they, in that sense, I argue in the book, become the true sort of constituent authors, the true authors of this new institutional order that of the post-colonial world. Right. And I think this is not just the case in India. I would sort of, venture to argue that in most post-colonial countries, you had a similar kind of dynamic play out vis-a-vis the continuity of the state apparatus and the administrators and their prominence, therefore, in this transition. And that's kind of what you see. And many of the smaller kind of historical moves, which, for example, why does India accept dominion status rather than direct independence straightforwardly, right? Which something Congress had been opposed to earlier. Or, for example, why does Congress, who had been demanding an elected Constituent Assembly, give up that demand at the very end? So all of these, or why does Congress, for example, keep in power almost every single colonial official, police official, army official, including people who have played a major role in repressing Congress itself? So all of these smaller things become clear once we understand this particular dynamic, that they make this really critical decision that the modality for post-colonial transformation would be the state rather than popular politics.
Great. Let me now move on to some process-based questions.
Sure.
So I was wondering if you could share what you found sort of the most challenging part of the writing or research process, and then maybe also what you found most rewarding about this project.
That's a really good question. I think the challenging one, again, I think I might have said it already once, the methodological part was challenging. There's this kind of an obvious thing to say it's a challenging to bring together disciplines. But I think for me, the bigger challenge was, say, I'm a political theorist, and before that, I was a lawyer. And in both of these disciplines, I think we are trained to sort of read texts, coherent texts, right? You have a given text, and then it's a question about interpretation and reading and going on from that. That's how you do history of political thought. That's how you do legal theory, or even legal analysis. And here I was saying that actually what I had to do is go beyond that, right? To look at all these conflicts and battles of political battles and conflicts, which are taking over the course of this transition years, right? Whether in the field of property, whether in the field of rights, in terms of popular movements, labor movements, internal Congress ideological battles, and so on. And so the challenge was, how do I create kind of a coherent theoretical narrative, right, out of all these multiple factions and pieces, right? What are the kind of archival claims one can advance in that? What counts as an archive in this case? What counts as a text? And I think that how to read that in that sense, right? How do we read all of these political battles and institutional maneuvers, all of this into a coherent legal and political theoretic claim? I think that was the one, honestly, I found the most challenging. That's the one sort of, it took me various ways to kind of get to that. And I think I still have debates sometimes when I present this with historians or legal scholars who, question me on some of those methods. So that was for me the most challenging one and the most time consuming one in some senses. The most rewarding one, look, of course, there's always, there's all these rewarding moments in writing when you kind of figure out an idea, figure out a pattern. But I would maybe say something a bit lighter and relatively minor, which is, I think, for me personally speaking, I realized that a lot of times, like these novels, there's a big amount of literary productions in India from the 30s, 40s, and 50s, right? In this moment. Precisely, I think because moments of political turbulence produces new kinds of literary, I think, forms and productions, especially novels, plays, poetry. And I kind of read them already, always, but I kind of started understanding that they had a lot of insights, in these kind of ways, often better than you can get in historical documents. And so kind of gleaning that and finding ways to incorporate that in the writing itself. That I found especially pleasurable. It felt like good to be able to kind of bring these things in and use these literary forms in what is otherwise sounds like a very unliterary piece of writing.
Great. And I guess, a lot of our viewers and listeners are early career scholars, so folks finishing up their PhDs, trying hard, as all of us did at one point, to turn that PhD into a book. So I was wondering if you had any advice for early career researchers on writing a book, or on just the process.
I don't know whether I can claim to have enough wisdom for people. It took me, a lot of work and figuring things out as I went. I think perhaps maybe the best advice I got from one of my, sort of not really advisor, but someone who like read the manuscript and gave advice is I think, I think sometimes as academics, this is maybe only applies to or legal scholars, which is that sometimes it's good to be able to draw from the political moment we are in. And it's not just so much that we have to write a policy piece. I think sometimes they think that if you speak to the political moment, it has to have some kind of policy prescription or speak directly. But I think there's a way in thinking that historical work is always, in some senses, a reflection on your present condition, right? And to be sort of clear about that, so draw from that. And in my case, I think I drew from that. The way I did draw right from that is that I think when I began writing this book, already there was sort of in India, where I'm from, the crisis of liberal constitutionalism was beginning to be apparent. And by the time I was writing the book, of course, that became a more global issue, right? And I think to me, that kind of served as a context to think about, how do we make sense of that? Because one way to sense of that is to say that, oh, the world has turned illiberal, what can we do, right? But other way to think about that is to think about constitutionalism in this longer historical context.
Mhm.
Think of its sort of contradictions, its cracks, which might develop over time. And you could think of these things with question like, say, democracy in the post-colonial world as well. So I think that to me kind of gave me a compass or a way about thinking about these issues, which I think was for me really helpful in kind of finding a grounding for that. And so I don't know if that necessarily counts as a good advice as such, but I think having a sense of the political moment you are and letting that speak through your work, rather than trying to only speak to a scholarly debate, narrowly defined. I think for me was really kind of opened up the way I would could think about this.
Okay. And final question, now that you've had a little bit of time since this book was
Right.
published, what are you on to next, or what are you working on now?
Yeah, so I think there's the immediate next project actually kind of flowed from this a little bit because it sort of goes back to this question of kind of promise and contradictions of decolonization. And the what I was realizing when I was researching the part on property, especially that pretty much every single newly decolonized country in 20th century, so basically all the countries of Africa and Asia, had some plan for public ownership. And if you call it nationalization, call it public sector industrialization, and it was literally without exception. So that then raises the question, what is the relationship between decolonization and public ownership, right? Why is it so? It just can't just be this, a contingent factor. It had to be some logic to it. Or if you think of it a step further, which is to say that how can we think of decolonization on the axis of property and ownership and not just the axis of sovereignty, which is eternity, I think, right? So that's the work now. And it has some similarity with this because again, it involves going into, there are legal questions, there are economic questions. The material is sort of all over the place. There's no one kind of, manifesto to look through it. And that's the kind of, that's the work I've been sort of engaged in for the last 2 years.
Yeah, it sounds like a great project, and actually even broader because you're not just looking at India, right? You're looking sort of
Yeah, so this
comparatively.
time I'm looking at actually countries in the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia. which all of which had, and it's just sort of looking at the kind of the arguments for that, the legal sort of debates which happened both at international level, but at the domestic level, the arguments made from the point of view, let's say, of democracy, of state formation, citizenship, labor, all of these things, come around this one kind of question, which is very oddly overlooked, really. There's not even doesn't exist one single book on this, and it's something which is kind of faded from our memory because it feels like, a very different time. Yet I think it has also a lot to say to our moment, again, speaking about political moment, when we're thinking about the nature of private and public power, right? How can private ownership can give you public power over politics and of society? I think that was something which was really being sort of debated and looked at the moment of decolonization, and something I want to kind of recover.
Okay, and on that note, let's wrap up. Sandeepa, thank you very much for this again. Great conversation.
Thank you. Thank you very much for doing this.